Hi everybody. So in last night's Zoom, I successfully navigated baking biscotti live without tripping, spilling, or burning myself. The only downside is that the first 3 or 4 minutes didn't tape properly. So we're cobbling together a video for you using the first few minutes of the practice run. So as promised, here we go, how to make traditional Italian almond contucci.
Hi everybody. Today we are going to be making contucci, or traditional Tuscan almond biscotti. I have fielded a lot of questions about this recipe over the years, so I thought I'd show it to you. My only fear about showing it to you is that it is so incredibly simple that all of the mystique of my cooking expertise is about to evaporate. But I'll share the secret with you, so here we go. I start with 7.7 ounces of flour. I like to use a mix of all-purpose flour and white whole wheat. I find that having the white whole wheat adds a bit of a toothsome crunch to the cookies. Then you add in 1 cup of sugar, a teaspoon of baking powder, half a teaspoon of salt, 1 cup of crushed almonds. I've been adding a little bit of orange zest. I feel like it adds a beautiful aromatic component when you're pairing it with the late harvest Sauvignon Blanc. So this is the zest of an orange. And we're going to put in our paddle. And mix our dry ingredients. To this, we're going to add 2 eggs and about half a teaspoon of almond extract. And that's it. Here goes the blender. While the mixer is going, I want to tell you that this is an excellent recipe if you have a standing mixer. The dough tends to be really stiff, so it's a lot harder to make if you're using a handheld mixer. And depending on the humidity and whether or not you double the recipe, sometimes you may need more than 1 egg, but you want to wait for that batter to come together as a ball. This would be a good opportunity for me to tell you that it's really easy to modify this recipe. I originally did it with chocolate-covered almonds, which made it an awesome pairing with the Zinfandel. And I would add cardamom and all kinds of exotic aromatic spices. So I think you can see that this has sort of come together as a ball. And from here, we're just going to pat it into 3 lobes on a parchment-lined sheet. So hopefully you can see me here. I'm not sure that you can, but I'll pick it up when I'm done. But basically, I'm going to take my dough and divide it into 3 equal portions, about the size of a baseball. And then you just give it a little bit of a roll, get it into a log, and I'll show you what that looks like. So again, you take about 1/3 of your biscotti dough, about a baseball size, give it a roll, give it a roll. When you have a little bit of a log, you're just going to pat it down. All right, and then this is my last little ball of dough here. All right, you can see, you can just pick up the little edges from the bottom, the last little crumbles of dough there. And again, a baseball-sized piece, you just divide it into thirds. You start as a hot dog, press it out flat till it's about 1/2 inch of thickness, and so that it's shaped like a Band-Aid. I don't know if you can see these without them sliding off. There we go. So yeah, so they're kind of shaped like Band-Aids. And from there, you have the option. If you like, you can add some Swedish pearl sugar if you have that around. And it looks very pretty. You can just sprinkle that on the top. It'll bake right in beautifully. More often than that, I'll add just some sparkling white sugar. Also to the top, it sort of gives it a little bit of that crunchy edge. Or you can add nothing. So let me do a quick wash of my hands. I'll be back. Really, I'm here. You can't see me, but you can hear me. So I always used to put the sparkling sugar on my biscotti. And then when I would go on the road, I'd put them in a big Tupperware. And then I'd put that Tupperware inside of a trash bag to prevent the little pieces of sugar from going everywhere. And despite my best efforts, the little crystals of sugar would migrate into the nooks and crannies of my luggage and into my socks and underwear. So frankly, now when I go on the road, I don't even put sugar on top of them. And from there, these will go into the oven at 375 for 25 minutes. Ryan, can you set me a 25-minute clock? And through the miracle of technology, I just happen to have some that have been baked for the first time. And they'll come out of the oven looking like this. What a miracle it is. So from here, the trick with biscotti is that you bake them twice. So from here, what you'll do is you'll take each, you'll let them cool for 5 minutes so you can handle them. And you'll take each one out and you'll put it on a cutting board. And from there, you're going to cut each log, which I par baked about 3 hours ago. So they'd normally be softer than this. You will cut them into 1/2-inch pieces. Which, as I said, normally is quite a bit of an easier process than this. And you're just going to cut them into pieces, and then you'll transfer them back to your baking sheet. And the trick there is you're going to want to separate them so that you can get some airflow, because when they bake the second time is when they firm up so nicely and get that beautiful caramel color. That makes them so excellent dunked into things. And for the second bake, they're going to go into the same oven at the same temperature for 14 minutes. All right, so while those are in the oven, this is sort of the most excellent time to sort of talk about the late harvest Sauvignon Blanc. So for me, the Sauvignon Blanc was very much inspired by a traditional French Sauterne. And as you know, a Sauterne is typically a mix of 2 grapes. It's Semillon and Sauvignon Blanc. If I could have gotten my hands on some Semillon, I definitely would have added it in, but I was really grateful to get a hold of fruit from John Bucher. So he agreed to sell me this small ton of fruit on a couple of conditions. The first condition was that I didn't drive him too crazy. And the second condition was that I promised to pick before he and his wife went on their river cruise to Germany at the end of October. So as I was sampling fruit, I went out to the vineyard, and it's this beautiful little gem of a hidden vineyard. And my minivan would, bump over these roads on the Bacigalupi property, and we'd go up this little hill and down and dip back up. And then across the way from some of the old vines in Zinfandel was this little hidden 2.5-acre vineyard of Sauvignon Blanc. And it came down a swale and back up the hillside. And I would go out there and sample the grapes, and they were always just so delicious. All of my sampling notes would say things like, bursting with guava, awesome tropical flavor, so delicious. And I found that the first few rows of grapes that were closest to the post tended to be the most flavorful. And that may just have been the way the sun hit the vineyard. Maybe they were ripening first. But I called John and I said, you know how you promised that you would hold a ton of fruit for me? How about you don't pick the first 3 rows of grapes along every single row? And he just laughed. He's like, you told me you weren't going to be a pain in the ass. So he did say that I could pick the 1 row I wanted for him to save. And the fruit continued to be delicious. So we brought the fruit in, and I had this super cool idea that to get a little bit more of the sugar to soak up, we would do some skin contact. So skin contact is a super cool trick with Sauvignon Blanc. It's not super popular, but it gets used a lot. So one of the advantages of skin contact was that we could amp up the sugar. So any little grapes and raisins that had been shriveled down, we could leach out that sugar by leaving the skin and the fruit in contact with the juice overnight. Of course, the downside of that is it can get wonky with the pH and the potassium, and it also really has the potential to add bitter phenolics. So you need to be really careful with the timing. But you know, I always like to try new stuff, so I thought this would be a great idea. But I really wanted to keep the fruit cold overnight. So I think Brian's going to share a picture on the screen with you guys of what we did. So we de-stemmed the fruit, and take it away, Brian. He can't find it. Is it on there? Oh, I can't see it. Okay, so that picture, is it the fruit or does it have plastic wrap?
That's fruit.
Okay, now I can see it. So we covered all of the fruit with dry ice to prevent it from oxidizing. And then the interns helped me package it up top to bottom with plastic wrap, so we wouldn't get any oxygen in there to keep it really fresh for the next day. Perfect, now you can unshare. All right, so I'm like, this is awesome. We're gonna get more flavors. We're gonna get more sugar. Okay, so who can guess what the big problem with this is for the next day? Any guesses? How do we typically handle white grapes? Do we de-stem them? No, yeah, you're correct. I see everybody is nodding no. We don't de-stem them. And having the stems in there acts as a press agent. So the white clusters typically are not de-stemmed, and when we put them into the press, they press against those stems, and that helps us to release the juice. Well, now, because everything was already de-stemmed, we had to figure out some kind of a press agent to put into the press so that we could extract the juice. Well, the way we did that was with rice hulls. And luckily, John Bucher, his main business besides selling grapes is he has a massive ranch, of cattle ranch. So he always has rice hulls around that he puts down for the cows. So we had some rice hulls, and we put some scoops into the press, and we got a good press, and all the interns hated me because it was such a pain in the butt to clean out. And from there, we put it into a tank, and we let it ferment to the place where I stopped it. Okay, so, which brings us to what is really tricky about doing a dessert wine? Can anyone guess? Like, what are the complications with having something fermenting with yeast, but with dessert wine, you don't want it to ferment to dryness, right? Any ideas? Any raised hands? Perfect, okay. You got it, Brian? I see, perfect, go ahead. I see Jean's iPad.
I was thinking about stopping the fermentation so that the residual sugar lands about where you want it.
Exactly. You are exactly right. And that's the tricky part. So it involves a little bit of basic math, but you take your starting sugar and use a coefficient and figure out where you want your alcohol to end up. And then you take how much residual sugar you want and add that to it, and that should be your starting Brix. There are yeast on the market that are specifically engineered to be helpful for dessert wines, in that they don't have a high alcohol tolerance, right? Because you don't want a yeast that can, you know, a big muscular yeast that can ferment this crazy, you know, Martinelli jackass din to 17.5% alcohol. You don't want it to do that. You want it to start to die off at, you know, 13% alcohol. So these have a lower alcohol tolerance. And the other thing that they purportedly do is that they flocculate well, which means towards the end of fermentation, they tend to clump up at the bottom in a tight little pile, which makes it easier for us to take the wine off of the yeast. But even when it's done with fermentation, you're totally right, Alan, we continue to fight Mother Nature, because we're in a winery that naturally has this big population of native yeast, and now we want to keep that residual sugar. So I was really excited to make a late harvest wine, just because it sort of stretched my wine making skills in a new way. So you're always fighting against microbial stability. Luckily for me, you know, fermentation went slowly. We kept it cold. And that's something we talked about with the rosé. Does anyone remember why we ferment cold? What's an advantage? Aromatics. When we keep the wine cold and do a slow, cold, or cool fermentation, it does a better job of maintaining all of those beautiful aromatics, which make late harvest Sauvignon Blanc so perfumed and intensely pretty. So luckily, the fermentation ticked down slowly, slowly, slowly. And when we got to about 6 Brix, somewhere between 6 and 7 Brix, it really started to slow down on its own, and it tasted really good. So that's the point where I decided to rack it off and put it into a barrel. And then, as I said, of course, it's really tricky to keep that sugar when it's in a barrel, because of course we can't totally sanitize a barrel and eliminate all yeast. So what are some of the other things that are tricky? So a traditional Sauterne has between 80 and 120 grams per liter residual sugar. So that is my benchmark. If you look at the late harvest Sauvignon Blancs in the market these days, whether from Napa or Sonoma, any of the domestic ones, they're all over the map. There are dessert wines with a lot more sugar than mine, some with less sugar than mine, some with higher alcohol, some with lower alcohol, some that had been fortified. So there wasn't really a distinct domestic style template for me. So as I said, I went with Sauterne parameters, and mine ended up being 83 or 86 grams per liter residual sugar. So I was really happy with that. Traditional Sauternes do have significantly more barrel time in aging. And I'm sure everybody has been regaled with stories of Brian, the CF No. And when I told him that we could keep this in barrel for 3 years, he promptly nixed that idea. He's like, you can bottle it with the rosé in February, and it will be good for cash flow. So that's another reason, another way that my late harvest diverts from a traditional Sauterne. Okay, I'm gonna go and pull the par cooked biscotti out of the oven, but we're gonna leave the original guys in there. So give me 1 sec, just so they don't burn. Perfect. So as I said, these guys had been par cooking a little bit earlier, so they were a little bit harder to start with. But traditionally, they go in for 14 minutes. These went in for 11, but you can see they're golden brown. They are a little soft in the middle, and they will firm up as they cool. So once I managed microbial stability and had a plan for how I would stop fermentation, and then once I stopped fermentation, how I would maintain that residual sugar, and had a plan for barrels so I could get the aromatic profile I was looking at, I pretty much thought I was out of the woods. I'm like, oh, well, all the hard winemaking stuff is behind me. Well, that's when I got snookered by all of the logistics of bottling. So first of all, the Bellissima bottle is super duper pretty. But as you can see, the top of the bottle is much fatter than the neck, which just means that it's really hard to find a foil that's gonna fit without folding. So when we bottled this wine, I stood on the bottling line and I had to hand place every foil on every bottle as it went by, kind of like I Love Lucy with like the candy factory. And that was because if we allowed the machine to manually place the foils, they tended to pleat and fold and they didn't look pretty. So then I'd pull them off the line and take off the foil and start all over again. So in the end, it turned out that it was easier to do them manually. And it was okay because I think I only had like 46 cases. But it was still like, it was mind-numbingly boring. The other bugaboo came with the licensing for the label. So I didn't know, and now I do know, that when you call something a late harvest wine, the TTB has very specific criteria about what you're allowed to put on the label. So one thing you need to have on the label is bricks at harvest. So I submitted the label with the degree bricks at harvest with a little circle for degree. And the label designer put that on and we submitted it to the TTB for COLA approval and they sent it back. I had to write the word degree, D-E-G-R-E-E. Okay, so we fixed that, sent it back in, and it needs to also have the residual sugar. So I had RS, residual sugar. They sent it back to me a second time because it needed to spell out residual sugar. All right, back to the label designer, back for my approval, submitted back to the COLA and the TTB, or the TTB for COLA approval. At that point, I sort of lost sight of the forest for the trees because I'd totally forgotten to put the AVA on it. So they sent it back to me a third time, at which point I put Russian River Valley on the label, and it got submitted and approved. So that was sort of the headache of bottling. And let's see, what else did I want to tell you about this? So as I said in the beginning, I really wanted, where did the biscotti go? the teenagers absconded with my biscotti. Teenagers, come back with the food. I only need one. I don't want the one you licked. All right, off you go, teenagers. So I did really want a late harvest dessert wine that people would find approachable and easy to drink. So that really informed my decision to not fortify this. So as you guys all know, port, for example, is fortified with brandy, and there are some late harvest wines out there which are fortified, but I really wanted to keep this approachable, something that people would not be afraid to open up with dinner or the end of a dinner party, which is why I opted to not fortify it with anything. So I think the alcohol is below 13%. I think it's like 12.5 or 12.6%, which makes it the perfect addition and the perfect way to end a dinner party or just a nice evening at home. Ooh, 35 minutes, we're right on time without a baking snafu. All right, so hopefully people have been submitting questions to me. Do people have questions?
There's a question about when you're going to do the next round. When is the next harvest of the next vintage of late harvest?
So I'm thinking about doing it this year because we're down to fewer than 10 cases left. It's definitely the kind of project where I don't have to do it every single year. but I'm definitely hoping to do it again this year, which will be super fun. And now it should be a breeze to get the label approved. Go ahead. Other questions?
A very technical question of paddle blade versus dough hook on the mixer.
That's a great question. I've used the paddle blade. I haven't ever done it with the dough hook, but because, as you pointed out, the consistency ends up being like dough, like bread dough, where it comes together in a ball, it would probably work okay with your dough hook. I've always used the paddle for years without issue.
Chuck wanted to know, let's see, difference between late harvest and ice wine?
Yeah, that's a good question. So ice wine, it gets the dehydration from being frozen. So that tends to be a terroir and a locale driven phenomenon. So over the course of harvest, you know, even if we were to wait into November, we're not likely to dip below freezing. So with ice wine, the grapes freeze overnight and they become dehydrated, obviously, because the water precipitates out as an ice crystal. And that leaves the grapes wrinkled and raisiny and really concentrates the sugar. So that's how you make ice wine. In contrast to us, we were looking for botrytis to help us shrivel the grapes, the good botrytis, to help us shrivel the grapes and increase the sugar. And we did have a little bit of botrytis, and we also just increased the hang time and let them dehydrate on their own a little bit. But that's a great question, which is why ice wine is traditional in cold areas, and everybody, you know, associates it with up in Canada. They do a lot of ice wine, and I think in upstate New York, they do ice wine too, because they're gonna get those much colder nights where things are gonna freeze. But that's a great question. Same technique, same issues facing bringing in high brix grapes that don't have a lot of yield. Right, so that's the other thing with any kind of dessert wine or making wine with any kind of dehydrated berries, of course, is that you have to pick a whole lot of them to get a very small amount of concentrated juice.
Have you tried making the Biscotti gluten-free?
That's a good question. I haven't, but I'm a big fan of the King Arthur Baking Company, and I know they have a huge array of different gluten-free options and different mixtures that are gluten-free. Like they have a pastry mixture and they have a bread flour mixture that I guess would give you higher protein without using gluten. So I would definitely look to King Arthur Baking to try to figure out the best flour substitute for biscotti. Awesome, you guys. So and last question, Brian and Donna, do you want to introduce us to your pup? Do you want to unmute yourself?
We've been unmuted. This is Luca, that we call sometimes Loco Luca.
Cujo.
Where's
Jasper?
He is a, how many months?
He's a little bit over 4 months.
4 months, and we
Jasper.
adopted him from a colleague who was not able to care for him.
Jasper.
He's a golden doodle. And then we have another rescue pup who is going to be hard to see, but we'll try to
We'll try. This is Jasper. He's 9. He's a Bernese Mountain Dog rescue.
Let's see if you can see
There
him.
he is.
Aww.
Yeah. So
he's hating the newest addition to the family.
Well, as you guys know with the Torrey Hill label, we are always fans of dogs. Okay, and then I see Stephanie. You want to show us your pup? Stephanie is, she's right below Brian. Do you see her?
Yes.
All right, show us your pup.
It's actually a cat.
Oh. That's so funny. Show us your cat.
Yeah, so she's like kind of like a dog. They're the most dog-like pack animal cats. So
Welcome. Okay, Todd, is that I'm trying Bella, right?
yes.
All right, show us Bella. Oh, she's waving her.
Hi, Bella.
Hi, Bella. All right, and we've got a parrot. Parrot?
Yes.
All right, Alan, let's see.
So this is AJ. She's a double yellow-headed Amazon. We hand-fed her as a chick, and she's been with us for almost 23 years.
Wow.
Which is maybe a third of her lifespan, so we've got to do some estate planning, I think.
So did she say Pinot Noir?
No, but it's a good thing we have to stay muted because she's been singing and talking the whole time you've been on.
She's like, Biscotti, Biscotti.
Yes.
All right, you guys. Well, thank you so much for your time today. I want to remind you that Brian just added late harvest to the website. So if people are interested in buying a bottle or two to try with their biscotti at home, you can find it online. You can either use the link that we provided in yesterday's email, or secondly, you can go to the website and go to acquire and then purchase. But everybody, thank you so much. It has been such a pleasure to see everybody every week. It really just has lifted my spirits tremendously. And I'm just delighted. So thank you so much again for sharing an evening with me.